Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Center for Teaching and Learning webinar. We appreciate you joining us today. Our topic for today is Terrorism on Trial, a look at the Supreme Court's decision in Opati versus Republic of Sudan. And we have Dr. Edward Maggio here from our School of Business. He's one of our faculty members, and he will be presenting to you today. Before we jump into the presentation, I do have a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, questions are definitely welcome. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. We will be using the Q&A feature in the Zoom to manage any questions that you may have. So to use that, go ahead and click on it. It's in the bottom of your Zoom. If it's not appearing, you may have to just hover over your mouse. You can click there and type your questions. In addition, we will be recording the presentation. So if you would like to take a look at it later or recommend it to others who weren't able to attend, then definitely do so. We will be posting it in the Commons in our CTL Resource Center. Give us 24 hours to get it up. But I think that is it for housekeeping items. I do see someone has a question though right away, and I just want to make sure everyone's in. And yeah, we're glad you're here. Thank you, Dr. Finnemore. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Maggio.
All right, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I do appreciate for those who are with us right now, you taking the opportunity to listen to my short little talk, and certainly happy to answer some questions when we get near the end. Just going to load up the PowerPoint, and I think we can get this going. And as mentioned, our topic today is the Opati v. Republic of Sudan case before the Supreme Court, which I had the honor and privilege, along with my firm and additional firms, to go before the Supreme Court against the Republic of Sudan. And I'm going to get into the details as to why we brought a lawsuit on behalf of terrorism victims against a sovereign country. What I plan to cover with the presentation, I'm going to go over the nature of terrorism litigation, just because it's not something that most people in the general public have an understanding of what in this area of law we actually do. I'm also going to go over the details of the Kenya and Tanzania embassy bombings in 1998, which is the source of this case. I'll go through some of the specific procedural and case details itself. I'll also talk about how the impact of the Supreme Court's decision is going to be influencing future cases that involve terrorism. Some housekeeping rules, just as a short disclaimer. I do want to make it very clear the viewpoints that I'm going to cover in this presentation are mine alone. They're not from NCU or endorsed by NCU or my law office, which is the Miller Firm LLC. I also have to advise people we are going to be talking about terrorism, so there will be discussion of past and present events, terrorism in general, including details and some photos that I have that are unpleasant. So I want to give people a little bit of a heads up on that, and certainly if you're uncomfortable, I can always send you my contact information at the end of the presentation. I can always send you a transcript of this if you want to read a written transcription, if you're not comfortable with the slides. Whatever I can do to accommodate, I'm always happy to. And also, as already indicated, we're going to hold all questions to the end. And I do ask no political questions. Whenever I do a presentation, I generally get asked questions about political parties and which party or past president does things better or worse. I tend to avoid those questions, but anything else related to the topic at hand or the nature of terrorism, I'm happy to address. So let's get into it. What is terrorism litigation? I often, when I'm with my wife, if we go to a house party for one of our friends or family members, and I have somebody that doesn't know me that asks me, what do you do for a living? And I say, well, I do terrorism litigation. This is the point where generally the music stops, people tend to look at me, things get quiet, and they're very curious. And by the way, for those that forgot, were parties where they were these things way back in 2019 when people would get together and like have food, drinks, music. They were a great time. I highly recommend them if we ever get a chance to have them again. But it's a fair question when people ask me, what do you do for a living? And specifically what it is that I do is if I'm dealing with a victim or a victim's family of terrorism, we bring civil lawsuits against the specific countries that sponsor that terrorist incident or the terrorist group that carried out the incident. That includes Iran, Syria, Sudan, North Korea, and Saudi Arabia. And we do this through the US federal court system. And I also want to say that terrorism is not limited to any religious group, creed, or gender. In addition to these countries, my office also handles litigation involving the alt-right, and including we represent some of the victims from the Charlottesville rioting that occurred in 2017. Unfortunately, human nature is what it is, and terrorism is not limited to any one particular group. But also in specifics, some of the areas that my office covers, we handle Iranian improvised explosive device cases, or IED cases. And what we mean by that is very often our US servicemen and women, they're attacked by Iran using proxy forces. And I don't mean in a combat setting. In other words, you may have civilians having coffee at a coffee shop. Unbeknownst to them, someone specifically from Iran or an Iranian agent has planted a bomb or roadside bomb to attack them, not in a combat situation. That's terrorism. We also have situations where we have the Iranian government using their military and forces to arm local civilian groups to go out and carry out terrorism against US troops. Again, that's not permitted by the rules of warfare. That's considered terrorism. And we're allowed to go after Iran when those incidents occur on behalf of US servicemen and women. We also deal with Hamas attacks. You can be a US citizen, you're visiting Israel, and unfortunately you or your family get injured by rockets fired by Hamas. Well, very often those rockets are supplied by Syria or Iran. So in turn, we are able to pursue lawsuits against those countries for those incidents in which people have been hurt. We also deal with 9/11 first responder cases. Now you may be asking yourself, well, although 9/11 is tomorrow and it was so many years ago, how can there still be litigation? Well, many of our first responders are only now just seeing the injuries that they're sustaining. Many of them have just developed cancer. It's taken a long time, but it's now directly caused by their efforts to rescue others and to recover bodies at ground zero. Those injuries they're suffering now, we're able to bring suits for them to try to get whatever compensation we can or medical assistance they need. And lastly, US citizens injured abroad. Any US citizen that anywhere in the world is injured by terrorism, we potentially can bring a case on their behalf. But what does that entail? We have to, in a terrorism litigation case, cover a number of areas, and these are just some of the big ones. Firstly, social assistance for victims. Very often, if someone has had they're a victim of terrorism and they're either severely hurt or killed, before we can even begin trying to put together a lawsuit for them, we have to take care of these people. For example, many of our clients, as I'll cover today, who are in Kenya, we had to essentially make sure these people were in a safe location, had basic necessities such as running water, get them medical care, make sure that they're stable in order for us to be able to get the information that we need to be able to proceed with the case for them. So this area of law has a very high social work aspect to it. If people aren't safe and secure and getting healthy and getting better, there's no way for us to proceed with the case. So that has to be addressed. We also do a heavy amount of research and investigations. And I like to tell people, we look at terrorism cases very differently than would, per se, just a personal injury law firm. If there was a suicide bombing and it killed 10 Americans in a disco, we're going to deconstruct what happened. For example, the bomb itself is composed of a power supply, an initiator, an explosive, and a switch. Those are 4 separate components that we are going to research. How were they obtained? How were they put together? How did the individual bomber get to the location? We may look at, they came over on a commercial ship. Who owns that company? All those parties, organizations involved allow us to basically pursue them and their involvement in any terrorist incident so we can bring litigation against them. I also deal a lot with, as I have here, technology applications. Terrorism has to be funded. In order to fund terrorism, there's now everything from non-physical banking entities, in other words, bank websites, where terrorists use to move money. You have blockchain applications, use of cryptocurrency, use of criminal activity and scams, especially if we're dealing with North Korea and fraudulent goods. We have to track and pursue companies that are engaged in moving money and assets on behalf of those terrorist states that I mentioned. And of course, we do a lot of courtroom advocacy and litigation. We have to go to court for people. We have to stand up for those that are injured and seek justice for them. But one of the benefits of this area of law is it is a small network of firms that we're involved with. There's only a set amount of firms in the United States that handle this area of law. And the one thing I could say that is a great thing about practicing in this area of law is that for the most part, we all know one another and we all work with one another. Because very often on a case that can be very difficult, each firm has a unique speciality that we may not have. So for example, there's a firm I may contact in Chicago that is the best investigators in Israel if I'm dealing with an Israeli rocket attack case where Hamas injured US citizens abroad. Likewise, I have another firm I may deal with that's in Philadelphia that has some of the best information when it comes to maritime shipping if we're trying to track anything that Sudan and Iran are doing as far as illegally moving assets to fund terrorism. So it is a unique brotherhood of firms. We work very well together. It's one of the, as much as there are a lot of lawyer jokes that lawyers like to fight one another, it is a unique area of law in terms of how we cooperate with one another. And lastly, this area of law, we're dealing with suing nations. And to do that, you have to work with the US government. You have to deal with the State Department. You have to deal with the Department of Justice. You sometimes have to deal with agents from some of those three-letter agencies. And as I'll get into a little bit later, it can be sometimes a good thing. It can be sometimes a bad thing, depending on the politics of what's going on. We're dealing with geopolitical situations. So sometimes us suing a sovereign nation may be something that the United States government favors. There may be times where the United States government does not want us bringing that type of litigation because of what's going on at the US State Department level. And I'll cover that in a little bit. But I just want to kind of give a little bit of a quick overview of the unique nature of this area of law. So let's talk about the case. And I also want to be clear, when we mention the case name, it's not just the Opati family. We're talking about, and I'll give you the specifics in just a moment, we're talking about a large group of plaintiffs. And for those of you that have Hulu, you may have watched the hit television show, The Looming Tower. You may be familiar with this. The start of this case deals with the coordinated attacks that occurred in 1998, specifically against the US Embassy in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. 2 truck bomb scenarios. I'll show you a picture of the buildings in just a moment. But they severely damaged and destroyed a large part of both embassies, killed over 224 people. Thousands of people were wounded, catastrophic injuries. It's one of the worst terrorism attacks in U.S., if not world history. Also, it was the first major attack by Al-Qaeda. Essentially, this was their entry point onto the world stage as far as carrying out such large-scale, organized, coordinated attacks. As I have here, 3 years later, they were able to carry out the 9/11 attacks. I do like to take a pause from a brief moment, especially with 9/11 being tomorrow, that something I often say to some of my colleagues, especially if we have law school interns that come in, it's very easy when you're reading a lot of case law, you're looking at spreadsheets that have fatalities, injured, and you're putting things together for litigation. It's very easy for attorneys to sometimes forget this is about people. These are people that we're representing that have gone through horrendous circumstances that words in many cases don't do justice for what they've gone through. And I always like to remind people I work with that sometimes we do need to take a moment and realize when we're talking to our clients that they do need that extra hand-holding. They shouldn't be treated as just an average personal injury lawsuit. I was even telling a law intern the other day, how you talk to a terrorism victim, it's not the same way you're going to talk to somebody that was an offender bender in a personal injury case. So I had to stop an intern who was basically trying to get quantitative data out of the client and just to say, ma'am, how are you doing? How's your family? I heard so-and-so, I heard your daughter had a child, your grandmother now. That's great. We have to show a lot more compassion to practice this area of law. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's something that it's a unique nature of doing terrorism litigation. And I think that it makes us better practitioners when we take the time consistently to remember why it is we're putting those late hours at the office, why we're doing what we're doing. Now, how did Sudan fall into being liable for the embassy bombings? Sudan, for many, many years, was essentially, especially in the 90s, the place to be if you were a terrorist. Specifically under the regime of Omar Bashir, Sudan basically became the place where terrorists could train, they could use banking, they could get equipment and supplies. And this was the perfect storm for al-Qaeda to come in, for bin Laden to set up the initial operations for carrying out the attacks that came later. And specifically under Bashir, he got two major objectives under this. Having terrorists in his country allowed him to maintain control and power while gaining prestige in the Middle East. It also allowed President Bashir and his family to rob untold millions upon millions from the nation of Sudan itself. Although he's no longer in power and he's facing corruption charges now in Sudan, we still are trying to find all the money that he stashed away throughout the world. Also, for those of you who are into human rights, you may have heard his name before. And I have a little aside at the bottom. This is also the same individual that helped to ensure that the Darfur genocide became a reality. So this is not an individual that can really stand on any principle that he's innocent or blameless. If not for the nation of Sudan under his leadership, al-Qaeda would not have gotten the start that it did. It would not have been able to carry out those embassy bombings. And believe it or not, as we'll get into the specific case, Sudan itself does not shy away from that. That in fact, their involvement caused these attacks to be able to happen. So how did my office get involved? Well, specifically, we got together with a number of those brotherhood firms I mentioned, and we brought the case against Sudan itself in federal district court in DC on behalf of the victims and all of their families. So we're talking over 500 people and a massive suit, as you can imagine. And the first question I generally get asked is, well, how can you sue another sovereign nation? Don't we have diplomacy? I've seen the movies. I've heard people say diplomatic immunity. How does that work? Well, it is true. You know, between nations, their citizens cannot just sue another nation. So, for example, my mother-in-law was in Italy. She got a parking ticket. She's mad at the Italian government. She wants to sue Italy. You can't do that. Sorry. However, there are circumstances when you can bring a civil lawsuit to recover damages against a foreign nation. And that specifically deals with this exception, the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, or FISA. And specifically, the language we have here has to deal with if a foreign state is engaging in certain activity, they're not going to be immune. What do we mean by that? A foreign state shall not be immune from the jurisdictions of the court of the United States for personal injury or death that was caused by torture, extrajudicial killing, which is terrorism, aircraft sabotage, hostage taking, or provision of material support or resources. So under this definition, where Sudan provided material support and resources, they're liable because they helped fund and support al-Qaeda from the very beginning. In 2008, Congress gave us another tool. They allowed us to be able to pursue punitive damages against a sovereign nation that is a state sponsor of terrorism. Now, punitive damages, I know sometimes you see things on TV, you see, lawyers make a lot of jokes because they obtain these large personal injury lawsuits based on punitive damages. But I want to take the time to kind of illustrate why punitive damages are so necessary if you're suing a country that has sponsored a terrorist attack. Now, imagine we have a situation where somebody's been killed by a terrorist attack. Yes, we could bring a wrongful death case and pursue damages that way. Their death and their inability to provide for the family gives us economic damages. Their death allows their family members to bring a salvation claim, loss of company. Her husband was killed in an attack. The wife and children can bring a case. But not all of our cases deal with the loss of life. As I mentioned, with these embassy bombing cases, while a large number of people were killed, we had thousands of people who were severely injured. Now, why is that important? Punitive damages allow us to bring a case to get damages for the family members when they don't fall into those first three categories. So imagine, and I hate to use this graphic example, but imagine your husband was severely hurt in a bombing. And what I mean by that is bound to a wheelchair, half of their face was removed, they've lost their tongue, they're blind. You as the family now have had to adjust your life. You've been upset since the moment you saw them at the hospital. You've gone through severe psychological trauma and it requires counseling. You've had to now, some of the family members have had to quit their jobs in order to care for their husband, their father. Without punitive damages, we cannot pursue damages for that family that is going through those difficult times, that has suffered the trauma of seeing their loved one hurt by a terrorist attack. The first three, wrongful death, economic, salvation claims, are very powerful claims and damages to obtain. But the punitive allows us, for many of the families where, yes, the loved one is alive, but they're not in a position where they were before the attack, and the families suffer because of that. Punitive gives us that ability to go seek the recompense for them. So how did this case start? Well, originally we filed it in 2001, Federal District Court in DC. And some of you are going to see, well, why is there such a long time between 2001 till the ruling? Well, suing a country takes a long time, and federal court doesn't always move as fast as it should. But nonetheless, 2011, we got the ruling that Sudan was liable for supporting Al-Qaeda in the bombings. Go forward a few more years. By 2014, we finally got final judgments. We were awarded $10.2 billion in damages against Sudan for the victims of terrorism. Then finally, believe it or not, Sudan at this point never appeared in court, never sent counsel, just allowed us to keep moving the case forward. 2014, they finally stepped into the situation. They filed an appeal. At the appellate level, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals vacated the punitive damages. As I've illustrated before, that's a severe setback for us because the thousands of people who were injured, their families are effectively being cut out of being able to get any form of compensation. We felt that was wrong. We felt that that's not what the statute, especially the 2008 amendment created by Congress, had ever intended. So we appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed that this was a matter that they needed to decide. And specifically, the question going before them has to deal with that FSIA exception in and of itself. Can it be applied retroactively to impose punitive damages? And as I mentioned before, we brought our case in 2001. In 2008, Congress created that amendment specifically for these type of situations. And we also understand more about terrorism now than we did back in 2001. We know that terrorism today is not about just targeting and hurting victims themselves. It's about doing catastrophic and grotesque damage for religious and political purposes to influence as many people as possible. So it's not just hurting the victims themselves, it's about causing their families to suffer. It's about, having people in their community see their loved ones on TV, dead, maimed, severely injured. The larger the audience, the better for a terrorist. We understand that more now than we did in 2001, which is, as our position was, why Congress gave us that amendment, specifically based on our modern understanding of the goals of terrorism. So we went to oral arguments. We brought in Matt McGill from Gibson Dunn, who was amazing. And I also want to drive home, this is, as I indicated before, this is a team effort. You can't do these type of cases alone. And we had a number of firms that we came together to present this argument. And we argued the intent of Congress with FSIA in the 2008 amendment was that punitive damages were intended to be applied and to be applied retroactively. We had counsel from the Solicitor General, that's the attorneys for the United States government, who also supported our position. Then this is where it gets interesting. We had Sudan's counsel argued, as you can imagine, to the contrary, that Sudan should not be held liable. But for those in the audience that are either students or you're a law practitioner yourself, this is something you're not going to, what I'm about to tell you, you're not going to see on the written record when you read it. And specifically, I want to cover 2 points. One, this is why even with the best legal education and $1,000 suit, you should always be aware of your audience, all of your audience. Because the scene that you have to imagine, we're in the Supreme Court itself, the inner sanctum. It's not as big as you might think. It's actually probably a lot smaller based on whatever you're thinking. But imagine majority of the people there that day are families from Kenya whose loved ones were severely hurt or killed. That's packing the majority of the audience that's watching these oral arguments. Then counsel for Sudan gets up and very nonchalantly says, before the 8 justices, Justice Kavanaugh had to abstain because he was involved earlier in the case, he says the following, the attorney, well, I think instead the record shows Sudan at most was negligent in controlling people within its borders. And it's not like, I want to make clear, Sudan, is not accused of being a terrorist, but instead providing an environment that allowed terrorism to foster, again, long before bin Laden was a notorious terrorist. The attorney said this very nonchalantly, like, hey, okay, mistakes were made. And it shocked all of us because we could not believe that an attorney before the Supreme Court would just very nonchalantly describe Sudan and President Bashir's involvement with Al-Qaeda, which nobody disputes at this point. Even Sudan itself has not disputed this. There was like a brief moment of pause, and you had people, those loved ones I mentioned in the audience, some of them who came all the way from Kenya and Tanzania started weeping. And at this point, the Supreme Court justices, it was almost like universally they all stood up in their chair. Even some of the justices who were kind of, actively listening, but you could tell they weren't 100% engaged. It was almost like all of them popped up when the attorney made this comment on the record. It was almost like just, you could see all of the justices as we pan left and right were in awestruck that the attorney made this comment. And specifically Justice GORSUCH really drove and just started pounding this attorney with questions. And it essentially in a weird kind of way, this attorney did more damage to help us than we could ever have hoped for just by making this comment. Well, what happened? Well, surprise, we got a unanimous verdict from the Supreme Court, which surprising in the highly charged political era we live in, we had all 8 justices agree with us, and the majority opinion written by Justice GORSUCH confirmed that Congress did expressly authorize punitive damages. So we got a win. That's a good thing. However, it is just that. We still have a long way to go, which brings me to my next slide and some points here. President Bashir is no longer in power, as indicated before. He has been removed. There's an interim government that's in power right now. Right now, there's essentially a political battle going on in Capitol Hill. You have the interim government of Sudan saying, look, okay, we acknowledge what we did wrong. We acknowledge the Supreme Court case. However, we're on the terrorism state sponsor list. We, Sudan, we're trying to work with you, the United States government. You lifted sanctions against us in 2017, but we're still listed as a state sponsor of terrorism. We need to get off the list. We have no way of paying this money. It would take us a long time to do it. How about you give us a pass? Just give us immunity and we'll work on with it. And obviously our position and the position of the families we represent, the other firms who also are involved, we're essentially fighting a battle on Capitol Hill now that Sudan should not be given a pass, that they need to compensate these families who have been waiting an awful long time for some form of compensation. But more than just compensation, they want justice. They want an apology. They want an acknowledgement from Sudan that they're responsible for catastrophically hurting or killing their family members. So we're kind of, we're waiting to see what happens. Obviously, the political nature of what's going on is unique and something that, we're hoping for a positive end result. We don't expect, and we, knock on wood, don't hope that Sudan is able to get our Congress to get a law passed that gives Sudan immunity for what they've done. But it is a risk, and it is being talked in the halls of Congress right now. So we're going to do our best to maintain the political pressure and see what we can do to make sure our clients are protected. It also affects Iran, because Iran essentially is waiting to see what happens with Sudan. Iran has billions upon billions of judgments against it for supporting and or carrying out terrorism. And we have a large amount of litigation against Iran. So essentially, if Sudan is given a free pass, this essentially opens the door for Iran to then approach the United States and say, we want to negotiate what we owe for supporting or causing terrorism. Give us a pass too. So we also have to keep the political pressure up on Iran. But the one positive I will say that we have seen is the support of the business community. As I mentioned before, doing these cases involves a heavy degree of investigation, heavy amount of research. We've had more companies now on their own that will contact us and say, hey, look, I'm not involved in your case, but I had somebody from the government of Sudan approach me about doing business in Sudan. They gave us some information I think is useful for the enforcement of your judgments for your clients. We'd like to give this to you. So we've had more American businesses that want to see justice done and have come forward in an outstanding way since we got our Supreme Court win, which is a great positive, I have to say, about this whole situation. So this is a good time, I think, take some questions. I do have my contact information up there. I will say I always welcome questions, but within reason and limitations. What do I mean by that? I had recently, a couple weeks ago, a student, hey, Professor Maggio, the Middle East, question. What do you want? What do you want to know? What's going on? Tell me the whole breakdown. Can you be a little more specific with a question? I just want to know why things are the way they are. Start in the beginning. And that's too broad of a question for me to answer. I mean, where do I start with that? Okay, first the earth cooled, then the dinosaurs came, then they died, they became oil. If you have a question, just try to be very specific. That's all I ask. I can't do an open-ended question like, why is terrorism happening? We have to be a little specific. If you want to pick a region or a specific group, I'm happy to answer that. So with that said, I'm happy to open the floor open if there are any questions.
All right, I see Dr. Shad Bailey has her hand raised. I'm going to go ahead and let her talk so she can ask her question live. I think you may just need to unmute, Dr. Bailey.
Okay, unmute. There, I did that.
There you are. Wonderful.
Okay. All right. You talked about defending people who are U.S. citizens. I'm curious, has anything ever been done about Jamal Khashoggi? He was killed October 2nd, 2018. The Saudis said that they would take care of these people who killed him. They were going to send 5 people to death. Those were overturned. They haven't died. And Khashoggi was murdered. And he was a U.S. citizen. He's a reporter for the Washington Post. What's going on with that?
I'll be honest, I don't know which. I know there is a firm representing the family. I'm not sure what they are doing with that case. I also would agree with you that he was essentially a targeted assassination. I also would add, I always get asked, how could you list Saudi Arabia? I thought they're our ally. This is kind of sad to say, but Saudi Arabia as a country puts the United States in a very difficult position because we're aware that there is funding for terrorism that originates from Saudi Arabia. We understand that you have a political regime that, in order to maintain power, has to engage in actions such as killing Khashoggi. But at the same time, they have oil and we have to do business. I can even tell you, if I have to sue Saudi Arabia, we use a short order form. In other words, they've streamlined it now, where instead of, if I sue Iran, I have to type out the entire complaint. Saudi Arabia now has short order forms where you basically can check off, what type of incident happened so you could file a lawsuit. It's a little disheartening. I wish I had a better explanation for you that justice is going to be easily pursued against Saudi Arabia for his death. I imagine his counsel, or I should say the family's counsel for the estate, realizes there's going to be a unique challenge for them. But I do think they may be able to pursue a judgment. We kind of have to stay tuned and see what happens. And I'm sure the family probably has spoken to people from the U.S. government about their concerns if any litigation moves forward.
I hope so.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey.
I have another question if nobody else does.
We have a few, but I think we have time, so go ahead, Dr. Bailey.
Okay, yeah, I'm just curious about another thing, and I don't know where this stands at all, but we've heard about U.S. troops being targeted for, by Al-Qaeda or whomever, terrorists, or targeting U.S. troops in Afghanistan or wherever they are. What's going on with that? Or is that something that your firm or any firm is looking at?
I can tell you I actively now represent U.S. servicemen that have been injured in Iraq and Afghanistan by Iran and other state-sponsored terrorist countries. So that is active.
Okay.
If a U.S. serviceman gets hurt tomorrow because they were hit by an Iranian-planted bomb in a non-combat scenario, we can bring a lawsuit on their behalf.
Okay. Are we doing anything with the Russian government and supposedly their role in this whole thing?
It's difficult, and I'll tell you why. And I actually had this conversation with a U.S. serviceman the other week because he was a retired combat vet, special forces, and say, hey, look, we know that some of the markings on the ammunition boxes are Russian. We know that some of it was funneled through a few different countries that are complicit. It becomes a unique problem for us because we can't always pursue every country that's involved. And this was an issue especially with the previous White House administration because, and I'm going to be very frank, thank God for the disclaimer, we, the United States, sell weapons. Other countries in Europe sell weapons too. So for example, if I have a terrorist incident and they used bullets from Germany, they used guns from Pakistan, they used Chinese mines, and they used Russian explosive material, we can't pursue a lawsuit against every one of those countries because our weapons too end up sometimes in the wrong hands. Essentially, we have to limit it to the terrorist organization and the specific country that funded them and supplied that equipment. Now, if that equipment comes from a diverse set of different countries, that's a possibility. But if we're dealing with, for example, there's a attack in Israel where Hamas shoots up a school, we're going to pursue Hamas and Iran that may have funded them. But we can't go after the bullet maker, the weapons maker that may be in other sovereign nations. If that was allowed, it would catastrophically impact world diplomacy.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey. All right, we have a question in the Q&A. How does licensing work internationally? I assume Heather's referring to law credentials.
Be a little more specific as to, on our end, if we're talking about the United States, you would be admitted to the U.S. federal system. So for every jurisdiction, for example, I'm admitted in the federal courts in New York. I'm admitted to the D.C. District of Columbia Court. But these type of cases, we're bringing on behalf of U.S. citizens, are going to be brought in the nearest U.S. federal court that we can.
Yep.
Majority of them are either Southern District of New York or District of Columbia. If the person wants to ask a clarifying question, I can ask a little bit more. I will say if we're bringing enforcement against a country in a different country, so for example, we're looking at, we have a case now involving pursuing a bank in England that deals with Iran. We would hire local counsel in the UK to represent our interest where they're licensed.
Okay, we have another question. Can you provide an example of how you prove that a state has sponsored terrorism, either within this case specifically or more generally?
Believe it or not, it's very often not that hard because they often take credit for it. In other words, they go on social media and they say they did it. If they don't do that, very often we can put, with an investigation, we can get people in custody, or if they're not in custody, but let's say the FBI couldn't get an investigation to have them arrested, we can, serve a subpoena on people and get people to say under oath that, who they were dealing with, and essentially connect the dots up. But a lot of times with these cases, the countries themselves do take credit for it.
Are the plaintiffs always Americans?
No, believe it or not, with the embassy, that was a great question. The majority of our clients in the Kenya and Tanzania bombing are not U.S. citizens. However, they were working for the United States government, so they're allowed to bring a case. So we can bring, if it's a non-U.S. citizen that has been hurt or injured while working for the United States or carrying out some function for the United States, we can bring a case for them.
All right, wonderful. We have someone else with their hand raised. Emmanuel, I'm going to go ahead and give you the ability to ask your question live. You may have to unmute yourself. Emmanuel, we do have you unmuted but we can't hear you if you are else.
I don't hear anything.
Yeah, I think you'll have to type your question into the Q&A, I'm afraid. Technical issues. All right, well, Emmanuel hopefully is getting his question or his or her question into the Q&A. Any other questions? All right, we'll give it just a minute, just in case of any last minute questions being typed. Okay. Have you had cases that have been closed successfully for the plaintiffs?
Well, these are. Putting aside these cases, yes, we have. The hardest part is not getting the win in court. The hardest part is getting the judgment enforced. That's the hard part, because for us to enforce the judgment, we have to go out and find where these state sponsors of terror are hiding their assets. So a large amount of what we do, believe it or not, is we end up bringing lawsuits, secondary lawsuits against banks, against corporations that are essentially hiding or moving funds or assets that we're entitled to. So that, believe it or not, is the hardest part of these cases. It's finding the assets, the money, and then trying to collect on it. But we're able to do so. It just takes a lot of time and a lot of work, but it is possible.
Okay. Do you see the definition of terrorism changing or evolving in the future?
I think it's going to continue to evolve, just as the technology that supports it continues to develop. I think the definition will continue. Think of it this way: when we had the beginnings of Al-Qaeda in the 90s, we did not have Twitter and the level of Facebook activity and other social media platforms that we have now. Look at what ISIS did with YouTube, essentially turning it into a propaganda machine for them. And we're still trying to understand how communication impacts recruiting, as well as inflicting emotional distress upon people. So I do think as we see more technology develop, we will see possibly either a redefining of terrorism or at least an expansion. I tend to use just a simplified definition, but I know there's entire conferences that have been held on what is terrorism? How do we define it? How do we understand it? Because one of the big problems with terrorism is it depends on your perspective. So for example, we can say, well, we're the victims, terrorism is bad. From their perspective, they may say, well, our political aim is correct. We're victims, and now in order for us to fight on the same level as you, we have to engage in this activity. That's one of the fundamental problems with defining terrorism is your particular stance or your particular position in a situation could affect whether you think you are a terrorist or not. I think the one part of the definition of terrorism I think most people can get behind is when you do catastrophic violence against innocent people who are non-political figures, who are non-combat troops. I think most people could get behind that there's no way to justify that. Unfortunately, there are organizations that think contrary to that.
Another question. I wonder if among casualties of Boko Haram in Central and West Africa, were there any American casualties? If so, what are the involvements of the US in terms of measures regarding your policies of defending American citizens?
I have to be honest, I don't really handle cases involving Boko Haram in Nigeria. I wouldn't want to give any incorrect information on that. That's a good question. Unfortunately, I don't have the background to supply that. But if the individual wants, certainly reach out to me. I could see if I could find one of my colleagues that may be handling cases involving Boko Haram. That way I can get you a little more of a definitive answer.
All right, and we have a hand raised as well. So Melissa, I'm going to go ahead and give you the ability to answer your question live. You may have to unmute yourself on your end. Melissa, it looks like we're connected, but still muted. Okay, well, we're waiting for Melissa. No. All right, I think, yeah. Melissa, if you would like to type your question in the Q&A, I think we might have a little bit more success that way.
I'm going to stop share out of this. Might as well. If anybody needs my information later on, I'm sure you can find me. There we go.
Okay, just give it a minute, see if anyone else has questions in the Q&A. But again, this presentation will be posted in the Commons, so definitely if you'd like to check it out again or recommend it to others, it will be in the Commons. Okay. What types of cases have you or your firm handled involving the DPRK?
Believe it or not, with the DPRK, more of a support role. There are, it's difficult, I'm under a confidentiality order, but I will say the collection activity for people who were able to get successful judgments against North Korea. North Korea does not appear in cases. So for example, Otto Warmbier, they received that large judgment. North Korea did not hire counsel in DC to appear. The hard part with dealing with North Korea is, as I mentioned before, the enforcement, trying to find their assets so they can be seized. Unfortunately, I'm limited what I can talk about that just because we have some ongoing projects. But I can tell you that's primarily where our focus would be, trying to collect on behalf of people who've already successfully obtained judgments against North Korea.
Question from Paige. Do you also do cases for domestic terrorism?
We do. I mentioned in the beginning, we have litigation against the people involved with the Charlottesville 2017 incident. It's catastrophic what happened, but the problem with those type of cases with the alt-right and these neo-Nazi groups is they're what we would call judgment proof. In other words, they have no assets. Many of these guys, I hate to use the term, they live in their mom's basement. So it becomes really just a symbolic victory that we're able to get these judgments against them. But a lot of what we try to do is still look at, well, who's funding these groups? Because if we can find the source of the funding, whoever's responsible for that, we can hold accountable. And it's not easy. It brings up a whole nother area of law where we in the past have tried to deal with internet platforms which are protected under the Communications Decency Act. And if you look at the case of Charlottesville, this may shock people. I actually had a professional article about this, but there was a website that knew about all of the planning because it was taking place on their internet platform and did nothing about it. So essentially let the alt-right neo-Nazi groups build their entire structure and then carry out the 2017 incident. Yet they have no culpability. And they sit on that information. I'm limited in what I can get because they're protected under the Communication Decency Act. Same thing with Facebook, same thing with Twitter, that, yeah, they have terms and conditions and they can enforce them, but many of these startup companies, they may have a large amount of money, they may have millions of people using them, but when it comes to customer service, they may only have 20 or less people, which blows your mind when you think about it, for the amount of money they make and the amount of traffic they have. But the reason why they're not monitoring what's going on, or they're able to not cooperate with us when, hey, we know this occurred, can we get a copy of your servers? No, it's because of the fact they are protected at that level with the Communications Decency Act. It's frustrating, but we have to work within the letter of the law until the law changes.
All right, thank you. Well, I think we have addressed all the questions. So thank you again, Dr. Maggio, for coming and presenting to the group, and thank you for everyone that attended. We will be posting the recording within 24 hours in our webinars area of the Commons. And Dr. Maggio obviously shared his contact information if you'd like to contact him, but you can also contact us in the ctl@ncu.edu. But thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Take care.